And this is the Razor Sharp program with Sharon Firebrace. I've got with me right now John Passant, and he's from the Australian National University, but he certainly had experience and was the Assistant Commissioner in International Tax Reform at the Australian Tax Office from late 2002 to 2007 for almost a 4-year period. And he's also taught tax and tax law, that is, at the Australian National University and the University of Canberra. John, that's an enormous, credible background of experience that you've got. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, 35 years in the tax field.
Wow, that's what we need. We need experienced people that like yourself, that certainly that's had expansive experience as well as able to sort of teach what tax law is all about. I mean, I think that's a wonderful opportunity. Wouldn't you say that, I mean, tax itself and these accounting economic issues, well, I mean, let's have a look at what people are saying. I mean, they're saying that pretty much, I mean, we're in a crisis, are we not? I mean, economically. We've even had some of the Conservatives saying that we're in a crisis. When we've got people like Jeff Kennett saying that we're in a tax crisis, we're in an economic abyss. And even Andrew Bolt himself of the Conservatives saying that we're in trouble, is what Andrew Bolt has said. And Amanda Vanstone saying that the GST will have to happen because the states need more money. And similar to what Mr. Brumby's saying, who was the ex-Premier of the state of Victoria from the ALP, the opposite spectrum of the political circle. And he was saying there that similarly that the states are unsustainable. I'm just quoting him directly here. Unsustainable. They have an unsustainable fiscal position. Isn't that saying that, you know, we're on the rocks almost? And it's been under the leadership and guidance, really, and the control of the Liberal National Conservative government. That's the government of Mr. Abbott. Has had adequate time to turn things round, and now Mr. Turnbull's leadership. Do we see any prospects of any change now that they've introduced, John, GST on the agenda? How are you seeing, is GST going to save us, or is that just a total, lipstick on the pig? It's going to land us up a blind man's path.
Yes, I think when we look at what's going on and the current debates around tax, especially around the goods and services tax, I think it's an indication of a system, an economy that's in slow motion to crisis. I think what we're seeing now playing out in Australia is the slowing down of the Australian economy, catching up with the rest of the world who suffered their global financial crisis in 2008, and we were buffeted from that or kept separate from that to a large extent, not by government spending on pink bats and school halls, but by the economy of China. Now, the Chinese economy is in decline or is slowing down, and the Australian economy and the mining boom has ended. And the Australian economy is slowing down. So we're seeing unemployment at the moment at around 6.25, 6.3%. Predictions are it will fall next year, but I'm not sure that will be the case. We're seeing what we're got in terms of poverty, 2.5 million people in poverty. And what this government's talking about is the goods and services tax. Now, there's a logic to what they're talking about expanding the goods and services tax from its current rate of 10% to, say, 12.5% or 15%, and also including in the base things that are currently excluded, such as fresh food and health and education. They're talking about that because it would raise, according to some figures from Parliamentary Budget Office, I think, about an extra $65 billion if we went to the New Zealand model of a GST, which is 15% rate, up from the current 10% rate, and applying to almost everything. At the moment, Australia's GST only applies to about half of our consumer goods. So when we buy our bananas, they're not subject to GST. When we go to the doctor, it's not subject to GST. But if the base is expanded to include fresh food and health and education, water and sewerage, then they'll raise an extra $65 billion a year. Now then the question becomes, well, where is that extra revenue going to be spent on? And of course the states say, oh, it's fantastic, we'll get all this extra revenue so we can spend it on health and education. Yeah. As if they will do that. Well, let's leave that aside. But also, the business is saying, but hang on, we want that money for tax cuts to companies. Oh, do you? And then the government itself is talking about compensation. So we can't have it all three ways. You can't be compensating poor people for the impact of the GST if you're also going to give tax cuts to business and more money to the state. So it's got to be one or the other. And my guess is that they'll try and concoct some amalgam of all three, that they'll give the extra GST. Some of it to the states, they'll give some of it to business in the form of the tax cuts on company tax, and some of it in compensation. But overall, the general discussion about a GST is really just about making the tax system more regressive so that poor people and lower paid workers pay more as a percentage of their income in tax so that the rich pay less. And I think that's what it's all about. It's really about shifting wealth from poor people and low paid workers and average paid workers on the average wage, shifting wealth from them to big business and to capital. And I think that process has been in train for 30 years and it will continue. And that the GST is really a furphy. I think we should be framing this a debate in terms of how will we address poverty in Australia? How will we challenge the economic crises that are unfolding in Australia? How will we get rid of unemployment of 6.3%? And neither party, the government nor the opposition, have any answers for those questions. They'll talk around the GST and they'll talk about pig on lipstick like fair compensation, but they won't address the substantial issues of increasing inequality that's occurring and the levels of poverty that we have in Australia at the moment.
Yes, indeed. So that's, obviously the direction we need to go. But obviously that we're being hijacked. The issues, the policies are being hijacked by big business themselves. As we see the twist here to bottleneck and throttle the situation, the economic situation here. It's become almost Star Chambers, would it not be? Economics here, because it's going to be an enforced type situation. Upon the public, given very few other options, because did they not say that on the table revenue would be taken off the table and on the table would be expenditure only? So if expenditure is supposed to mean that GST raising is part of that expenditure answer, that's only sort of part of it, is it not? It's a bit of a mixed bag, because they're saying that there'll be income tax discussed as well, and then there'll also be cuts to welfare as well. So they're attempting to sort of, I suppose, confuse everyone with all these names and individuals and flood the place with reports and directions and recommendations and a number of different characters and personalities and a mix of business as well as government representatives. So it seems to be in a bit of a shamaz. That was one of the criticisms, I think, of the way that by which the Turnbull government's handling this case, that there doesn't seem to be a clear direction on this whole attempt to bring about what is seen to be a budget repair. It seems like the leadership on this really hasn't got much of a direction. They're stuck in the mud on GST, and it may very well be the issue that's going to cause this Liberal National Conservative government, the Turnbull government, to fall and to fall rapidly in the polls. Although, John, how are you seeing the play out there? The popularity of the government, the popularity of the leadership of Mr. Turnbull, it seems to have risen according to the last couple of polls. But then the polls were taken prior to, were they not? Prior to the heavier debate on the GST. How are you foreseeing that this will play out in the polls for the Turnbull government as we're preparing toward the federal election coming up very shortly?
Well, I think it's interesting in terms of the polls and also the election. Turnbull came out the other day and said the election will be in September or October next year, or it is likely that it will be in September or October next year. The current polls show, I think, two-party preferred, the Liberal National Party fixed 56.5% and the Labor Party 43.5%. So it would be a complete drubbing for the Labor Party and a resounding victory for the Liberal National Party if an election had been held when that poll was taken, and that was released on, I think, 3 November. But as you point out, that was before the GST debate really hotted up. Now, prior to the GST debate hotting up, the government under Abbott and Hockey was talking about, and also Morrison as the new treasurer, we're talking about us having a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Well, we don't have a spending problem. Australia's spending, government spending as a percentage of GDP is one of the lowest in the OECD. It's about 5 or 6 percentage points below the OECD average. And as for our revenue raising, it's about 7 percentage points below the average of the OECD. If we had an average collection of tax for government that was equivalent to the OECD average, we'd be raising $100 billion a year more. So I think one of the points here is that with Malcolm Turnbull in charge now, we've got a government who's able to do a lot of talking and do it in a nice, silver-tongued way about how things will be better. But it's all talk so far, and I think the problem for them is exemplified by the GST debate. Now, Turnbull has said, we're going to have a GST debate, and we're going to, of course, fairness will be at the heart of any GST debate. Now, that's Orwellian. How can you have a regressive tax that you make fair? You don't. I mean, the alternative really is, in the long term, this GST will hit poor people and average workers and low-paid workers more than it will hit rich people, and the compensation will be eroded. And that's the whole point, to make poor people and average workers and low-paid workers pay for the benefits of health and welfare and so forth, which they're also attacking. I think when we talk about welfare cuts, you can see what this government's really about when Christian Porter, the Social Security Minister, called the $17 billion that we spend on disability services, the disability pension and so forth, he called that a burden. I don't call that a burden. I call that something that we are morally obligated to spend, and we don't spend enough on people who are disabled. We don't help them enough already. What is a real burden is the $20 billion a year that we forego in revenue on the top 20% of income earners through tax concessions for superannuation. What's also a burden, to my mind, is the tax concessions on capital gains tax, which overwhelmingly go to the top 20% of income earners. Why isn't there a discussion when Turnbull says nothing is off the table in terms of tax? Why isn't there a discussion about a more progressive income tax system where we tax rich people more, where we implement a tax on the wealthy? So you look at the wealth figures in Australia, the top 10% of wealth owners own about 45% of all the wealth in Australia. The top 10%. Now, if we imposed a 1% wealth tax on those people, we would be looking annually at a return of about $30 billion a year. We've coupled that with getting rid of superannuation tax concessions for the rich, capital gains tax concessions for the rich, the exemption of the houses of the rich from the capital gains tax. If we did all of that, there wouldn't be a problem. We wouldn't have to worry about a goods and services tax. In fact, we could abolish a goods and services tax. And if we coupled that with a more progressive income tax system, then we'd be part of the way to addressing inequality in Australia. But we wouldn't be all of the way, because the main cause of inequality in Australia at the moment is not just government policy, it's also that wages as a share of national income have been falling consistently over time for the last 30 years. And now they're at their lowest point since records in 1960 began to be kept of the wages share of national income. Correspondingly, the profit share of national income is at its highest share ever. So we need to start thinking about what's going on here, and we've got a transfer of wealth from working people to capital that's been going on for 30 or 35 years. That's what's got to be addressed, and one way to address that is for us to win real wage increases, to say to capital and to government, we've had enough. We want a return of our productivity that you've been living off, our increased productivity over the last 10 years that you've been living off. We want a super profits tax on all companies that make super profits, like the banks. We want price controls to stop the banks upping their interest rates without any challenge, and therefore imposing extra costs on mortgage holders, and of course a flow through increased rents. All of these things are possible if we had a drive from below, and if we had a left wing in Australia that was vibrant enough and had appeal enough to put these arguments.
Yes.
So I think these arguments can be put and should be put. We just need to build them.
Yes, we do indeed. And as you're saying, we need the political process to take us there. But not to forget, too, that the people are the political power of the nation. And they are the centrepiece of the preamble to the Constitution. The people are the political power, but they need to exercise that power. And hence, information and knowledge is part of that power gathering, so that people can exert their position and exert their authority as well in the nation. So John, what you're stating is very challenging to us, but also it's giving us direction, and that is that we need to certainly start to focus on super profit tax. That's where the issue is. First and foremost, we need to address poverty, the 2.5 million poverty of the general public at large, and as you're saying too, the jobs and wages and the decline of jobs and wages has been the cause of the creation of poverty in the nation. And the lack of policy and program as well by government, but and industry as well, the shrink of industry, and I think too some of the very poor stats that's been collected. The worst budget we had in 2014-15 on a historical record by the Liberal government, by Mr Abbott himself, but also too it does run into 2015, John, because we do need to have within that a plan, and there's been a lack of plan and a lack of leadership and a lack of direction in favour of the public, certainly in favour of the corporations and big business and the top end of town, and certainly policies which are the neoliberal policies that have shoved, bucket loads, truckloads of the common worker public's wealth into the pockets of the big corporations. So in that, this is what's caused the shift and the change, as you're saying. But at the same time, too, the $4.3 billion that hasn't, it's one of the bad statistics as well, has not worked in our favour. The 4.3 trillion, I'll get back to that in just a moment. But we've got the Reserve Bank as well, John, that's saying that the 2.25% of growth has slowed, and it's not reached what the May budget stated in 2014, the 2.75%. It hasn't achieved that. Now, the May budget did say that it was going to achieve it and has not achieved it, and it slipped out to something like 3.5%. Now, this is even the Conservatives screaming about this. So this is interesting that we've been on this trial for some time, and we're finding now that even the Conservatives have turned against their Conservative leadership here in saying that, obviously, what's got to occur is, some direct change, and for the good of the nation, the good of the country. That's obviously where we need to go. So it's interesting to see that there's been this turnabout and turnaround. But poverty issue, yes, that's got to be addressed along with the homelessness as well, and lack of housing and adequate public housing. And then also, as you said, the super profit tax. Let's look at that, because we've seen where the public have lost their wealth. Certainly through privatisation and selling off the assets, and now the state premiers don't have the wealth that they need. Now they're cap in hand to the federal government, and they're saying, well, give us our chop. But then they're saying, well, for education and health, and as you said before too, that they're going to get something like an $18 billion cut, $80 billion cut in spending by 2017. This is the premiers of this is the states of, in this case, the state of Victoria, all the states and territories. So they're in for a bad, bleak time. And that sort of has a bit of a constitutional play out here, because if the states are bankrupt, or if they're bust, or if they don't have the revenue that they're raising, and if the federal government holds back the funding, which is going to happen in 2017, Victoria can certainly be they're going to be taking lesser revenue from the federal government. And we saw here too with the East-West link, John, with how funds, $1.3 billion was being held back by Tony Abbott to the Andrews government, who happens to be a Labor government. So the Liberals were holding back and using funding as a bit of a political football here to make it difficult for the Labor Party. So, you get caught up in this control by the federal government over the states, and in which case the states are almost becoming dissolved according into the Constitution, because the powers were to be laid at the state level. The states were to raise the revenue through the utilities, which is gas, electricity, water, etc., and any other going concerns, and I suppose sale of natural resources, gases and coals and so forth, or other energy sources. But if they sell all that off to private corporations, they don't have the revenue raised out of that, so they've come to a brick wall. There's been a spiralling debt hole for them, and now they're saying, well, the GST is going to fill their pocket, but that's to come off the backs of common Aussies. But then, not to forget too, that we, the public, John, we've been hit with the mass increased rising cost of living price rise, and it would be on food, education, health. I mean, if they bring in this additional GST, as well as the existing hikes in prices, the cost of electricity, gas, water, they're all shot through the roof. And bill shock has been part of everyone's home now, particularly in the last few years. So we're seeing here that the corporations are the winners, aren't they? They get in to buy these entities, these natural monopolies of us. But some of them bought them for a song, and bought them when they were they're very profiting. They're very good on profits. So the corporations won out on the sale of those businesses and utilities, and then now they get us to pay high prices, and then we, the public, are the losers, because now we lost our cheaper utilities and better lifestyle as a result, and now we're asked to fork out a GST on top. So we're now left with a double burger of double banger of double expense. So that seems to be the situation, John. So obviously what we've got to do is claw back. We've got to fight back and get back that which we lost. I mean, that's why it's got to be a super profit tax. It's got to be we've got to tax the banks for their profits they're making and the opportunity they've got here. We also need, as we said, not just super profit tax only on MRRT that was mining at the time, that Kevin Rudd went in to get, and got Julia Gillard when she overthrew with the coup that occurred within the ALP, it allowed them to write their own tax, and they ended up giving no tax, and also to offshoring of tax that should be paid here onshore. I mean, Google, Microsoft, IKEA, all these multinational corporations, they should be paying tax. And the super profits they should be paying here onshore. That needs to be addressed. That's where the debate should be going, isn't it? This is what should be on the table. Aren't they just, it's lipstick on the pig, thinking that, a GST is what is the solution here? It's not the solution. It's the mining. It's not mining, but it's the multinational corporations that really need to pay their tax.
Yes, I think that's right. If you look at the GST debate, I think it's a classic case of putting lipstick on a pig. GST is a pig, and what the discussion about fairness that Turnbull has cloaked it in is really just lipstick on that pig, because we as ordinary consumers will end up paying the burden of the increased GST over time. All people will pay a bigger burden as a consequence of this, especially if it goes on to fresh food and on to doctors' visits. Now, you mentioned the Reserve Bank and its growth prediction, 2.25%, which is down 0.5% from the budget estimates, which I think will mean that we'll see a cut in interest rates in the December or perhaps February announcements. But of course, the banks have already shown that they're about protecting their profits. We haven't had any change in the underlying Reserve Bank of Australia interest rate for a while now, and yet banks last month put up their interest rates, their lending rates on mortgages and so forth, taking extra money out of people. Why did they do that? Because they want to protect their profits, and perhaps they're making super profits, which leads me on to thinking about a super profits tax. The super profits tax is a good idea, I think, but I think we need to be clear about its limitations as well, that it only applies when entities are making super profits. And as the mining boom shows, once the mining boom has collapsed, mining companies may not now be making super profits in Australia or elsewhere because of the slowdown in the Chinese economy. There is a slowdown in the profit rates globally of big business, and that's starting to impinge on Australia. Marx talked about this many years ago as the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but I won't go into the details of that. But even banks today in Australia might have been suffering, so the argument goes, have been suffering in inverted commas, lower profit rates than they had in the past. That was one of the reasons why they increased mortgage and other interest rates, and why they're reluctant to cut the exorbitant rates on credit cards. Now that's linked as well. Credit cards are linked to increasing household debt. I think we've talked about this before. Our household debt's 133% of the GDP of Australia. Household debt at 133% of GDP. And a lot of that, or some of it anyway, is in credit card debt. Some of it's in mortgages, obviously. And credit card debts run at, what do you charge on your credit card? 20%. As wages have not been keeping up with inflation, people tend to go into higher and higher debt. And I think the issue around, or a lot of the issues around inequality and taxes and so forth could be remedied to some extent by a campaign for better wages, for real wage increase. But that would require a people's movement or a union movement, and we don't have one at the moment. But there are signs of outbursts around the world against austerity. In Australia, I don't think is going to be immune from them. And I was really heartened to see recently an example of civil disobedience, which was a group called Friends, Family and Feminists Against Detention, who staged a sit-in in Melbourne against detention of women and children and men in offshore detention centres. And that there was a famous shot of a friend of mine called Jill coming out of there with a breastfeeding baby. And what sort of world do we live in where people campaigning for the rights of others who are locked up with no charge offshore are themselves manhandled by police? And I think what the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a sense in which the fight back at least has shown glimmers that people are starting to talk about civil disobedience to win those sort of social campaigns. More importantly, I think we need to think about how the union movement and the workers' movement can win real wage increases to stop the shift in wealth from ordinary workers to big business. And I think that's the important question. It's not just the tax issues, but once we have a mobilisation of ordinary workers around better wages and so forth, it's more likely then that we can say, well, we can tax the rich. Instead of imposing a GST, we can tax the rich so that we can pay for better health and education spending, better transport, public transport spending, deal with climate change. The wealth is there. It is held by a small minority and we can tax that. But we need to get it not just through tax but through wage increases that challenge their right to make super profits. And I think that's going to be a longer term project. We need to just keep plugging away on programs like this, saying that we really need to fight back against austerity. Look around the world at the UK, at the US and the rise of political opposition to austerity in both of those countries. Look at what happened in Greece with the mass protests against austerity. Look at what's happening in Portugal with a left-wing government just being elected on an anti-austerity program. We need to mobilise people to get out on the streets to defend basic human rights, such as the right to seek refuge, such as the right to public housing, the right to public transport, but also we need to support unions and to urge unions to go on the offensive for better wages and to defend jobs. And I think that's where our real strength lies. We, the people, have the power to shut down the economy and to shut down the workings of the economy if we can mobilise to do that. And that's the task, I think, for the left, to challenge the rotten ways, to challenge both the lipstick on the pig that is Malcolm Turnbull, but also the pig that Malcolm Turnbull represents, the whole of process of capital accumulation, the big business interests that he represents of the Gina Rineharts and the James Packers and the Clive Palmers of the world, and to challenge them and to say we need better wages, we need better programs to address poverty, to address the massive imprisonment of Aboriginal people and to return their land to Aboriginal people, to have better health and education spending. And that's going to be a long-term project, which programs like this help to get those ideas out. So they're fantastic. And I think we're coming up to our 30-minute mark, so we should warn people that if you want to listen to any more, you need to go on to Razor Sharp and listen to the rest of the program there.
Yes, indeed, John. I think you encapsulated it very well, and that is that it's tough times ahead. We may find that Mr. Turnbull himself is going to be heading up the Banana Republic if he doesn't start to address the country and the issues and the policies according to the direction that people want and that people deserve. And that's the big challenge. As we see poverty at 2.5 million, that is a scary statistic. That's a very concerning statistic. That's a very challenging statistic, and the Liberal National Conservative government has certainly brought us very, very deeply into this deteriorating economic position. But John, you've been able to outline to us the situation, but the remedy as well, and the action and the direction that we all need to take. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
Thanks, Sharon.
Join me today.
Thanks, Sharon.
Join me today.
Thanks, Sharon.
Join me today.
Thanks, Sharon.